Hi, my name is Ricardo Sosa, and I'm going to present this visual paper called Design Thinking, a Visual Critique. Thank you to the conference organizers. I apologize that last minute I couldn't attend in person the conference, but I hope that this presentation makes sense of the paper. And thank you to Rodrigo Hernandez, who's going to present this in the conference. All right, so the paper cites in the abstract these works. Here, what I want to mention is that I'm very excited to see Learn by Design, the conference, opening the formats of the research outputs that they accept. I know that historically there's been a small number of visual papers, and being a designer, before I became a researcher, I thought it would be interesting to explore this type of research output. So please bear in mind, this is not usually the type of work that I do, but I'm very happy to explore what are the possibilities. So these two works here, I cite in the paper to make the point that there are types of arguments or provocations that can be visual, and they can contribute to the argumentation and the discussion of topics of interest in design. So having said that, visual arguments are not the same as arguments made with words. And so I'm going to touch on that a little bit during this presentation, but that's the first point. And I really want to encourage, if you get one thing from this presentation, it is that I would love to encourage everyone to explore that design side of their work, help work with your students to explore the possibilities of using visual arguments as research outputs. So I wanted to start citing this short story, really, by Jorge Luis Borges, Argentinian author and philosopher. And this short narrative is called Del rigor en la ciencia. This is a famous piece of writing by Borges, very philosophical piece of writing, because he talks about an empire that wanted to create the most accurate map of the empire. And the way they achieved it was by creating a map that was the same size as a territory. Obviously, in the story, the next paragraph says that map was pretty useless because it was the same size as a territory. So it was the most accurate map, but also the most useless map. I bring that up because in the paper I explore this idea of the granularity of mapping, the granularity of visual representations when it comes to the topic of design thinking. So my first entry point to this discussion is I think we all got a little bit exposed to the concept of clinical triage, especially during the COVID years. So this is just a diagram on how a patient or how someone who comes to a clinic is channeled or triaged depending on the symptoms or the symptoms they show, right, and what they say is wrong with them. So obviously we don't need to go into any detail, but this is just to show you kind of like the complexity already of just dealing with someone who comes into the clinic and what do you do with them. So it shows you with the boxes and the arrows and the then do this, then do that. It shows you that it's a fairly complicated mess. And I use the word mess like John Law uses it in his book, After Method, mess in social science research, because just like clinicians, designers make sense of messes, of messy situations, right? And so I wanted to use that diagram as an entry point. What happens if we bring that, let's call it clinical thinking? What happens when we bring clinical thinking to that level of kind of like 5 steps, like design thinking has been popularized, this version of design thinking ideas and Stanford? It would look something like this. You first start with symptoms, then move on to examinations, um, a diagnosis, a referral, and end up with a treatment. It is true. I don't think anyone would oppose the idea that clinical thinking can be mapped into these 5 stages. I guess the breakdown starts when people start using these 5 steps as if they represented what really happens in clinical thinking, and worse, if people teaching medical students, health professionals, if they would use such a reduced version of clinical thinking and interchangeably use it to teach things like clinical triage. So in the paper, obviously, what I'm making fun visually. That's the idea, at least. Whether it lands or not, the reader will tell. The reviewers were very kind, and I think they saw the point. So hopefully that's an indication of how the readers can take this. So the paper really is just a series of diagrams borrowing the design thinking kind of like now stereotypical hexagons, 5 hexagons with the colors they use, and kind of like mapping other ways of thinking, like creative thinking, analogical thinking, scientific thinking, and so on. And for each of them, I kind of like referred to standardized ways of referring. Say, for instance, in creativity, there is this model that starts with frustration. The next stage is preparation, incubation, illumination, and end up with a flash of in illumination, you have that flash of insight, and then you realize and you execute your creative idea. Analogical thinking or metaphorical thinking also has kind of like 5 or can be mapped into 5 boxes. Retrieval, mapping, inference, insight, and finding the limits of the analogy or the metaphor. Scientific thinking, you start with questions, look at the background, create a hypothesis, do some experimental work, and then you find the answers. At least that's the kind of like simplistic level. So I'm paraphrasing, visually paraphrasing other ways of thinking. Various people in design thinking say that it's not a way of thinking, it's a mindset. It's not a mindset, it's a tool set. No one really knows what it is, or we haven't really reached any agreement. But part of it, I guess, has to do with this idea that I tried to convey in the paper of how trivial it can be to reduce something complex to something so simplistic as 5 boxes. Again, for some purposes that might be ideal way of representing it. I'm strongly opposed to the idea of teaching design thinking to designers, but that's where we are. 10 years ago, we didn't think this would be the case. We thought design thinking was being taught to non-designers in schools of business, engineering, education. But nowadays, the boomerang has returned to design education, and a lot of design educators are using the design thinking framework to teach design to designers, which, again, that's probably what I wanted to make visible with this visual essay. Just like the design process can be very convoluted and confusing and hard to map, really difficult to map. I guess the future work, the next exercise I want to do is take the so-called double diamond, which again is not a process. It was never intended as a map of a design process. It's more kind of like to explain to clients where you are, at what stage you are of your work. But again, here we are teaching double diamond to designers when they design, as if an indication of divergence and convergence meant anything. So closing the presentation, just under 10 minutes. And this is kind of like a response to reviewers as well, and for readers of the visual paper. The diagrams presented in the paper don't need captions. Reviewers were suggesting that they needed captions. I think they don't need captions because they are the argument, right? And I use this quote. These visuals, in visual argumentation, these images show that just like verbal claims are used as the epitome of argument, these images can be seen as acts, communication acts, that inform an argumentation and a discussion. I do include in the paper, in the final version of the paper, I do include quotes from design thinking critiques of design thinking, verbatim quotes from people who have published on this, including Rodrigo, by the way, who is now in this session. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you again to the conference organizers. And I wish I could join in person, but I look forward to exchanges in the future on this topic. Thank you.